Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the Big Ten Media Days that are kicking off in Indianapolis today, and we'll be going through the week, and definitely a lot of really interesting things to break down in the Big Ten. But let's get into segment two. The ACC Media Days started yesterday, and there was already the biggest news that we were waiting for has already come out from that. Definitely huge news. Florida State and Clemson are staying put through the 25-26 season. Definitely a huge thing for the ACC, and has a lot of implications. Definitely something that answers one big question that we had is, is Florida State and Clemson going to be in the conference after this year? That has been answered. There's a million more questions that come because of this, and let's start to break those down. Definitely a lot to unpack here, and I think where I want to start is there are pros here for both, and there are cons here for both sides. And I think for the ACC, the biggest pro is you now have some time. You have time to fix this issue that has been created by two of your bigger entities in your conference. So it'll be really interesting to see how they kind of go about this, but it's time to get aggressive. It's time to kind of get out in front of this and start to bring in teams, start to throw out feelers to teams in the Sun Belt, in the American, in the whatever. It does not really matter all that much, but the reality is they need to start getting aggressive. They need to start putting their foot forward and be a little bit more intentional about the way that they're going about this, because frankly they've been sitting for quite some time trying to fight this in court and do all of the other stuff, and I understand it's a lot to juggle, but at the end of the day you need other teams coming in if these two are walking out, and they are walking out one way or another. They are finding their way out of this conference, and that would put you at 15 teams, and you have to stay above 15 teams, keeping that buffer above 15 teams where you're at 17 right now. If you can stay at that 17, 18 marker, then you're in good shape. If you can't, then ESPN's going to have a little bit of a problem with you, and you're going to have to deal with that. And that's something we'll unpack in a little bit. But teams like, USF, Troy, JMU, App State, whoever it is, you need to start getting some teams because excuse me, you need to start getting some teams because this is coming, and you're losing two big-time entities in your conference, and when they go, others might follow. So you have to keep that buffer alive. You have to keep that, 2-team, 3-team, 4-team buffer between you and 15 teams, because that 15-team mark is a really dangerous one for them to be on, because ESPN could just pull the contract if they go below that. So definitely will be a huge thing here. But another big-time con for this is you got to deal with these two teams a little bit longer, and that's obviously not ideal. It's kind of one of those things that I think Brett Yormark did an incredible job at when he was at the Big 12. He got hired and then fairly quickly got a deal in place to get Texas and OU out of the conference quicker, and that was the better thing for the conference. Not that, Texas and OU leaving was the better thing, but you had to make it happen as quickly as possible, because then you can figure out what life is after them. And I think this is the same case for the ACC. Now, the problem is you can't necessarily do that, because that would just be yielding all of this money over to them and not having them pay the exorbitant amount that you want to get from them. So it's a little bit of a battle here, but at the end of the day, as time goes on, that money drops a little bit and things get a little bit more sketchy, and other teams have more time to kind of figure out what they want to do. So that's kind of the biggest thing here, and maybe the biggest con for the ACC is the fact that there are other teams watching this, and they're watching it very, very closely. UNC, Duke are the teams that I've kind of circled the most, and I think a lot of people have for they are the ACC in a lot of ways. If ESPN or if whoever figures out that UNC and Duke are trying to find their way out, that's going to dry up very quickly, that media contract. I promise you that. So that's going to be the biggest thing here is at some point, Jim Phillips and this conference in general just needs to get more aggressive. They need to realize that their conference is changing very, very rapidly, and if they don't get two hands on the reins and possibly pull a couple of teams in during this time, then you could not be a conference in a couple of years. So that's the biggest thing for me is don't let Duke and UNC go. Don't let North Carolina State go. Don't let a lot of these teams that are on the periphery, are not necessarily the Florida State and Clemson's of the world, but they are huge teams to this conference. Frankly, UNC and Duke are likely bigger than Florida State and Clemson when it comes to the ACC. So it'll be really interesting to see how all of this kind of unfolds. But on the other side of things, Florida State and Clemson have a couple of pros and they have a couple of cons. The biggest pro is obviously going to be you got some more time to figure out what you need to do to get into the SEC or the Big Ten. If there's anything that can be done, I know Florida State is relatively close to possibly getting that AAU accreditation, and frankly, I think the Big Ten would come calling at that point. But it'll be really interesting to watch all of that, and definitely it just gives them a little bit more time to try to get into another conference other than the Big 12. Frankly, I don't necessarily think it's going to work, but at the end of the day, it definitely gives them a little bit more time to try to get that invite to where they really want to go, which is the SEC or the Big Ten. And then, obviously, the big pro is a big con for the ACC, which is the money is going to start falling. You know, the media contract is going to go a little bit further down. You won't have to worry about that quite as much, and maybe you'll be able to handle a little bit more of the financial strain of moving on from the ACC this time next year than you are right now. So that's obviously something that they're watching very closely, and definitely something that they very much want to happen. They need that money to drop pretty drastically if they want to get out of this conference, and obviously they are going to try their best to get it dropped through court and through some of these cases, but at the end of the day, letting some time run off and letting this thing kind of go down just a little bit could help them a lot. And then the biggest con here for me for these two teams is I don't know what happens in these conversations with the ACC and Jim Phillips for these two entities going forward. I don't know how you can go into these meeting rooms and have conversations with everyone else in the ACC when they know you have one foot out the door. And I think it could create kind of interesting conversations where a year ago we were talking about how Florida State didn't get into the playoff, and Florida State was not so happy about the ACC not necessarily being willing to go to bat for them, not being willing to be as outspoken as they would have liked for them to be in the playoff. And I can't imagine they're going to be that way this upcoming year if those two guys are leaving the conference. So that kind of adds an interesting dynamic that kind of is a little bit of the pettiness of college sports to a certain extent, definitely a part of this sport, and a very interesting thing that could affect Florida State or Clemson's season at the end of the day. If there is a college football playoff debate for them, their conference might not be the ones that are really going to bat for them. But that's definitely something that is a little bit hypothetical at this moment, and both these teams should be in the playoff at the end of the day, but it'll be really, really interesting to watch that. And then finally, the number one biggest thing that we have to watch out for in this next little bit as they're staying in the conference is there's a look-in clause for the ESPN contract in February of 2025. If ESPN walks into that room and knows that Florida State and Clemson have one foot out the door, and let's say in the next 4, 5, 6 months, UNC and Duke start looking a little bit more that direction. Maybe NC State does as well. Maybe Miami starts looking to exit the conference. If ESPN knows all of that walking into that room, there's no world where the ACC comes out of that happy. There's no world where they come out of those negotiations feeling really good about where they're at as a conference, because if you know that you're losing two huge assets as ESPN, you're not going to give them as much money. You're going to renegotiate that contract to make it more towards your interests, which are making sure that you're making as much money as possible. And if you lose these two entities, ACC is losing a lot of money. And then if UNC and Duke get in on the conversation, then you're pretty much cooked. I'm just being totally honest. ESPN is not going to come into that room if UNC and Duke are not on the table. If they cannot get that basketball game on their network every single year, they're not going to be interested in the ACC. And that's just kind of the reality, because there's been so many things about the ACC, particularly in college football over the last little bit, but if you're losing the teams that have dominated in college football, particularly Clemson, the team that dominated in college football for so long in that conference, and then you're losing the two biggest basketball products, maybe not only in the ACC, but in the entire country, in Duke and UNC, there's no way ESPN is coming to that table with anything that you like to hear. So that's kind of the biggest thing here, and it could be the biggest domino that messes up the ACC, that keeps it intact, that, it'll go any number of ways, but that's going to happen in February. All of that stuff is going to really start to go down in February of 2025, and frankly, if I was the ESPN executive and I knew that Florida State and Clemson were out the door, and I knew that other schools like UNC were looking in that direction, I would have very little interest in the ACC at this very moment, because the only thing that can happen if all of those teams are looking in that direction is the product can really only get worse. Now you can add some teams that make it a little bit, kind of temp that down just a little bit, but it doesn't change the fact that this is not going to be a conference that a lot of these big-time media companies are going to be interested in, because you don't have Florida State, you don't have Clemson for football, you don't have UNC, you don't have Duke for basketball. So it's going to be a very interesting couple of months. And I think the ACC now, you have a little bit of breathing room, but at the end of the day, you still got to get going. You still have to start adding teams, and you still have to make sure that you're in a place where come February, when you walk into that room with ESPN, you can sell X, Y, and Z. You can sell all of these things, and you don't just sell them for 2025. You can sell them for 2030 and for 2035, because that's the worry about this conference is, we know they're going to be around in 2025. Are they going to be around in 2028 and 2030 and all of these years that ESPN's got to worry about? So that'll be really, really fascinating to watch. But let's take our second break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about first-year quarterbacks in their new place and first-year head coaches. So combinations of first-year quarterbacks and head coaches coming together for the first time, and how there has been some really great success stories and there's been some not-so-great success stories. And we'll talk about how some of the big-time names in this year for that category, we'll break those down and see who has the best shot to make it happen, who has the best shot to kind of fall on their face a little bit. But we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.